Welcome to Murderabilia Exposed. I'm Andrew.
I'm Taylor.
We are launching a new podcast, basically around Murderabilia, hence the name Murderabilia Exposed. Today, we're just going to talk about how we got into collecting and dealing. And I'll go ahead and start out. So, everybody always asks me, and I'm sure they ask you the same question: how did you get into collecting? How did you get into selling? How did you get into collecting things from murderers? And how it started with me is my dad is a retired cop and detective of 34 years. He was a cop for 20 years. He was a detective for 14 years. And my stepmom was a 911 dispatcher for 9 years. And then she was a records department clerk for 14 years. That's how I got into, I guess, collecting. The first person I ever reached out to was Philip Jablonski, of course, a serial killer that's deceased now. And I didn't even know that you could write to serial killers or murderers in prison. And once I found out, I wrote to, Jablonski, Wayne Henley, Charles Manson, and 13 years later, here I am, still talking, visiting, writing inmates, visiting inmates, interviewing inmates, all that good stuff. And yeah, in 2015, I decided I had so much shit, artwork, fingernails, hair, all this random shit from murderers, and I decided I'm going to start a website and sell this stuff. And I didn't think that it would go anywhere, True Crime Auction House, and almost 8 years later, it's still thriving and still doing well. And yeah, it's definitely been, interesting. I've had a lot of interesting things come through the mail: pubic hair, fingernails that have dropped out onto my kitchen table where I eat, my food and everyday things. So that's a little bit about how I got into collecting and dealing. And so, what about yourself before we get into the next topic of discussion?
Yeah, I've talked about it in bits and pieces here and there in different interviews. I'll go a little longer on this just because I think this podcast, I think kind of both of our idea behind it is to be able to go a little more long form, talking about stuff, talking about more behind the scenes that people don't really get to see or don't really hear in the shorter interviews, like this will be usually an interview topic about murderabilia is more of a small format, 10-15 minute thing. But with this, we can kind of get into a lot of the behind the scenes stuff. Uh, so for me, starting, I had a full time job in a factory, and I was selling stuff on eBay on the side, like vintage clothing and trading cards and video games and stuff. And I started kind of amassing all these true crime items while I was thrifting. I had always had an interest in true crime, but never really looked at it as any kind of profession or any kind of like super serious hobby. But I was collecting all these things thrifting. I would find vintage magazines, like rare paperbacks. And then I found some O.J. Simpson pogs, which were a novelty item from the 90s. I put those up on my store because I figured there's a bit of value there. And they got flagged by eBay. Now, around the time when I put those up, I had just left the factory job. And pretty much within the same week, I think I had left that to do eBay full time because that was going pretty well. And that the listing got flagged. I got, I think, a 3 day ban because eBay is kind of selective about what true crime stuff they will allow and they won't allow. There's other listings of the same item that probably are still up there from that time that never got flagged, but I didn't want to take any risks with it. So the true crime stuff I was kind of putting aside for a long time and building up. Um, as that was happening, I was kind of getting interested in cults a lot. Jonestown specifically, I was kind of studying Jonestown. I had bought all the books on it, so I could kind of research everything. I had bought all the movies that had been made about it, all the magazines and newspapers that I could find. And eventually, when I started running out of the like lower hanging items, the easier to find things, I was like, well, I bet there's stuff out there that's more heavy, more connected with the cult, right? Like they were around for years and years and years before they went to Guyana. So I ended up finding like an envelope, piece of stationery from them. And then I found a copy of He's Able, the album that they put out. Um, the more Jonestown stuff I got, the harder it was to find things. I branched out into Heaven's Gate and then into Waco. And I had kind of known about Murderabilia a bit and people who collected it. And I wasn't super interested in that side of it. I was more interested in the cult stuff. But as the cult stuff was growing and growing, I was networking and meeting other people who had like wild things from serial killers or stuff that they got even in the mail for free from serial killers. So I started looking into that. And I made cult collectibles my website right around that time so I could kind of trade items and network a bit easier, have more of a hub for like, hey, here's all the things I have up for trade right now. If you want to look through my site, let's make it a deal. And it started just getting a ton of momentum really quickly. I wasn't doing any advertising really. I had an Instagram. I was posting some interesting stuff that I found, but as it kind of ramped up, I took more time away from the eBay thing and put more time into the site because I was making enough on there to kind of um, that it seemed like this could be a business. It could be a business in its own, and having more of a focus like that, I was really interested in. So it started picking up and picking up, and because I had when I was younger, I had an interest in true crime and in cults. I kind of had all this knowledge about things that been stuck with me forever. So I was able to kind of figure out what people were looking for, what were the most interesting cases or alternative sources of where I could find items, right? The big thing for me starting was that there were all these other sites that had been around for much, much longer. And I figured everything had been scoured, getting items from Bundy, your Dahmer, any of the big names, the old guys. You weren't going to find that because all the other people doing this, I figured, had scoured every avenue to track this stuff down. But the more I did research, the better I got with that kind of stuff. And especially having the cult angle because nobody was really focusing on that. I think it really just kind of took off. And now it's at the point where the site's my full-time job, as well as my own collection of stuff and items that I sell. I do consignment stuff. I'm putting a lot of time into YouTube right now as well, and TikTok for whatever reason. TikTok seems to be popular for me. But yeah, I've been expanding into that kind of thing, working with documentaries and media and stuff like that, and kind of making it almost a brand out of this as opposed to just a collectibles website. Kind of having multimedia and educational stuff and historical archive stuff like that.
And I don't know about you, but when I was younger in school, I was the weird kid that was always, other kids were playing Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! And I was out reading Helter Skelter and looking up on the school library serial killers, Charles Manson, and this and that. Was that you in school?
Yeah, well, I my little brother and I were really into horror movies, like obsessed with horror movies. It's all whether we watched when we were kids. And then I think from that, it kind of spanned into real life stuff. I was researching serial killers a bit and cults. I was watching a lot of gore sites, rotten.com, that kind of thing, just looking for like, it's almost like horror movies kind of got boring fast, and then I wanted to see darker stuff and real stuff, the reality behind it all, the inspiration for these things. So I started looking into the first case I got super into was Armin Meiwes, the German cannibal. I had heard about him through the Rammstein song they released about him, and then found it to be like a fascinating case. And I think it set off something in my brain that was a bit different because that case wasn't like, oh, this is an evil guy who did some terrible stuff. It was like, oh, this guy had a willing participant, right? He almost didn't go to prison. He almost got off scot free. And it was just so unique, the case. He didn't seem like a bad person. He just seemed like a very strange guy who happened to have a really strange need, and he worked that out for himself. And that, I think, sparked like, oh, these true crime cases are all different. It's not just like some angry man killing women. There's so much different stuff to research, so many different avenues to go down. Um, so yeah, that was like kind of my downfall into it, from being like a weird horror kid into like just obsessed with anything dark and graphic.
For those that are listening that I've never heard of that case, can you just briefly talk about Armin and what all went down in that case?
Yeah, so Armin Meiwes was a German computer technician. He was kind of a weird, eccentric guy. He lived with his mother his whole life until she passed away in this huge house. Uh, when she passed away, he kind of became a recluse. He just was at home a lot. He was on the internet a lot, and he was really into these cannibal role play websites. The Cannibal Cafe was the one that he was using mostly. People would post things about like their cannibal fantasies, and then he said, "Hey," he put up a personal ad basically saying, "I'm looking for a man like this. I want to eat him. It's my fetish. Contact me." Um, he ended up having somebody contact him saying, "Hey, it's my fetish to be eaten. It's my ultimate fantasy. I'd love to do this with you." So the guy came over and met him in Germany. They spent some time together. He said, "You know what? I'm not really sure about this." Armin drove him back to the train station, and then when he almost got back to the train station, he said, "You know what? let's just do it, whatever. They went back to his place. He got him a little drunk and they had to give him some pills, so he was a little numbed out. And then they cut off his penis together, tried to fry it and eat it, couldn't eat it because it was too tough, the meat. So the guy went up and laid in his bathtub and essentially bled out and died in his bathtub over a few hours. Then Armin took him out of the bathtub, strung him up, and butchered him like you butcher any kind of animal for meat, right? Which he actually filmed. There's a 4-hour video that's been in German police archives. It's like one of those lost media things where people have been trying to find it for years, but I don't think it's ever going to come out. But yeah, he butchered him, saved the meat, put it in his refrigerator, ate him over a few years, and then later on, he started to talk to more people on the site. I think he was looking for another person. He was talking to somebody, and that person was kind of looking at it as a jokey way, didn't really take it seriously. But then Armin was sending him some photos, and he realized, oh, I think this guy actually killed someone. So we reported it to the police, and there was a police raid. Yeah, and then through that whole thing, they found out that it was a willing participant, and he almost got off on like no charges or very slight charges in prison. But then at the end of the trial, they changed their mind, and he's in prison still now. But yeah, it was just like such a weird and unique case. It's been parodied in a ton of stuff, actually. I think Germans and cannibalism has always been associated now because of that in kind of darker pop culture. But yeah, that's the gist of the case. That was the first thing that I was super interested in, and when I finally got some items from his case, that was a very cool thing for me personally, because I didn't really know to what extent you could find serial killer stuff out there or true crime stuff out there, if smaller cases or less popular ones or ones that didn't happen in North America for that matter had stuff. But if you look, like, everything's out there, you know.
Yeah, I mean, if you look and you dig enough, you'll find things like, I mean, there's so many cases that are so obscure. Years ago, there was nothing out there of Pee Wee Gaskins, and of course Jeffrey Dahmer. You know, there was things that were
Yeah.
far and in between until, you release this collection, and it's just amazing
Mm-hmm.
how much is out there, even dating back to like the early 1900s. Albert Fish, Ed Gein. There's so many old cases where there's not much out there, but when you find it, you're just like, holy shit, I had no idea any of this stuff existed. And it's like holy grail after holy grail. And the average person couldn't care too less about something
Mm-hmm.
from Ed Gein or Albert Fish, whatever. But somebody like you and I is just like, wow, that's history. Like almost comparing it to like a JFK signature of sort. Not in the same context, but people view it as the same. Rare and just unique and out of this world. And I never knew that serial killer collectibles existed until like 2010, and it just kind of blew my
Mm-hmm.
mind and was like, people collect this stuff, and here we are almost 13 years later.
Yeah, I mean, my house is just like, it might as well be a museum for this kind of stuff. Like it's overflowing into every room. There's so many things that I have, obviously a lot of inventory on the website, but there's so much stuff that isn't posted and so much stuff that I'm always sorting through, and I'm getting new things in constantly. I got a huge box of stuff yesterday. Um, it's like it's endless. At first, I was doing a lot of stuff where I would look for things on eBay, save a lot of searches on eBay, and buy certain things there, or look on like smaller auction sites or independent bookstores, or just kind of weird spots. I would contact people local to areas where crimes happened. But the past year or so, most of my stuff has been coming from people contacting me. They found the site somehow and they said, "Hey, we have this collection, or we have these items. Are you interested?" Um, so I'm almost working as a broker as an extent now, where people bring things to me and I kind of see what the interest would be and what the value would be, and if it would be worth my time to manage the collection or whatever. Yeah, it's definitely changed a lot over the 3 or 4 years I've been doing this.
So when did Cult Collectibles like debut on the website?
I had an Instagram for a while called Collectibles, where I was just showing off some stuff that I had collected, and then I made the website based on that Instagram name, just because it was easy and kind of catchy. Um, the actual site started kind of at the beginning of the pandemic, right before the pandemic, actually, um, because that was when I kind of left that factory job to do the eBay full time, and then the site took off, I did that instead. So this was maybe 3 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. Um, but it's only been like getting bigger and bigger since then. I've been very lucky of I think the timing and also some of the stuff I've been able to find because I essentially put 3 years, 7 days a week into this full time, just only doing this stuff because I wanted to commit to this as a job, just doing this alone. And yeah, it was a lot of work, but it's been about 3 or 4 years to the point where I am now.
So one of the biggest questions I always get when it comes to murderabilia is this stuff legal? And is yes. And of course people might find it distasteful and they might think it's wrong or gross, but somebody like you and I selling, artifacts related to true crime collectibles is legal. However, in some states, I know you're in Canada, so this doesn't apply to Canada, but I know in some states there's a son of Sam law to where it's not legal for inmates to profit off of their crimes, but at the same time, they still do, with certain people. And what are they really going to do? Give them more time on top of their death sentences or life sentences or whatever. But yeah, murderabilia is legal, and there was actually a murderabilia bill that was put into court. I don't know, like 2000 through like 2005 or something like that. It was struck down, and I don't even think it made it past any type of ballot form.
Mhm.
It's no different than collecting historic artifacts, say related to like World War I, World War II. There's even people that collect artifacts related to like Ku Klux Klan and just very obscure, different historic events or timelines and throughout our history. And I don't know if you get that question a lot, but it's more than anything I usually get asked.
Yeah, I get asked it quite a bit. The way I kind of explain it to people is, and with the Dahmer stuff recently that I've been dealing in, that's one where people are saying like a lot of stuff about is this legal? How is this thing legal or that thing legal? I kind of explain it in this way, right? Let's say you go to a garage sale. Let's say I went to a garage sale and this guy had all this stuff out there, and he goes, "Yeah, this is a bunch of stuff that used to belong to Jeffrey Dahmer. I got given it by somebody. I just don't know what to do with it, right?" And then I bought it at the garage sale, and then I put it on online to sell. Um, you got to think about, if I were to buy a pair of Nikes at a garage sale and then go to sell them online, I don't have to get permission from Nike to sell those shoes again. It's my item that I purchased. I'm allowed to resell it. I wouldn't need to necessarily get permission from, I guess in this case, the estate of Jeffrey Dahmer to sell these items because it's just, there's things that I have that I'm selling. They're my possessions that belong to me, right? As with anything that you buy secondhand, anything that you buy used or whatever. Um, I think that people sometimes with certain things think it's a little more iffy, like items from prison, for instance, or like over here, Jeffrey Dahmer's urn, for instance, right? Like, well, how can that be legal? And it's like, well, because you can't, if you make a law about, oh, it's illegal to sell these things, and let's say I did pick this up at a garage sale, then the person that sold it at the garage sale, are they going to go to prison as well or be arrested as well and charged because they sold the things, even though it belonged to them? It's a weird thing to kind of try and um, legalize in that regard. Uh, yeah, I get asked quite a bit, but I think I don't really have difficulty explaining to people why it is the way it is. I understand that I think a lot of people that ask that are thinking about it from a perspective of, well, what about the victims of these crimes or their families or whatever like that? Shouldn't things go to them? And I understand where they're coming from, but you got to think like, let's say I have an item relating to Jim Jones. Am I going to track down the family members of 900 people and somehow split a $50 sale between all of those people and then get my cut, and that's going to be how it works? It's I understand the sentiment, but it isn't necessarily practical, right?
Right. And there's some things, of course, that are more I guess macabre and more offensive than others. Like I'd say that the
Mm-hmm.
worst things that are out there are the some crime scene photos, of victims. And more recently I've seen a lot of Dennis Rader, crime scene photos,
Yeah.
especially of his child victims popping up. And I can
Mm-hmm.
I can see, people getting offended by things like that, or anything, even just a letter from a serial killer, how like how sick and disgusting it is you selling a letter from, say, Wayne Henley or Charles Manson or whatever. But at the
Mm.
same time, this is dark history, at its finest, such as, I mean, people, like I said, people collect things from Nazi war criminal memorabilia, so on and so forth. So it's just a part of dark history, whether people want to acknowledge it or not. I mean,
Mhm.
Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, everybody has a favorite serial killer who watches true crime, yet
Yeah.
they want to, bash and run Murderabilia into the ground just because they don't
Mhm.
agree with it or they don't collect it or whatever. It's almost like, one could say like porn is very, gross and, you know, bad and, for the mind. But I mean, to each their own, it's their opinions, at the end of the day. And
Mhm.
people will either run with something or they won't. And, that's really that.
Yeah, and for some reason with Murderabilia, it seems to be people have more of a darker view on it. Like nobody's walking through a Walmart and then seeing a Time magazine printed, top 10 worst cult leaders of all time. They're not telling any new information. They're not bringing anything new out there. They're just rehashing old stories and publishing old photos of these things and making a profit off of it, right? But nobody's going after them and saying, "Hey, this is distasteful or rude." Same thing with, if Netflix puts out a true crime series that's just rehashing the same information that's out there. That's, for instance, the David Berkowitz series that came out a little while ago that was just telling the story of a book that was written about him. When that book was first written, people weren't like, "Oh, it's so offensive you wrote this book." And when that series was made out of it, which is just rehashing information, it wasn't like, "Oh, it's so offensive. You should pay all the families and you should do this and that." But Murderabilia, it's like a one step farther, I think, for a lot of people out of their comfort zone. I think a lot of people would be fine buying a true crime magazine at the grocery store or uh, picking up like a Blu-ray of a true crime series they really liked, or watching Mindhunter on Netflix. But and Mindhunter, for that matter, is purely entertainment based on real cases, right? But when it comes to the tangible items related to cases or related to individuals, that seems to rub a lot of people the wrong way, which is fine. I get it. I never try and act like a victim that I'm being persecuted in any way for what I do. I don't really ever feel like that. And I don't ever try and make an argument for if somebody is offended by it or upset about it or doesn't think I should be doing it. I don't try and argue my case about why I should be able to. I my kind of philosophy for it is just to keep my head down and mind my own business. Like I'm doing what I enjoy and what I think is interesting, and I don't want to upset or offend people, but that's inevitable. And all I can really do is just, you know, not um, not engage in any harmful way with anybody, and just let people have their opinions and do things the way I'm going to do them.
Another question and comment. I haven't really got this recently, but in the beginning years of doing this, it was, you must want to be a serial killer or murderer yourself because you're collecting this and talking to these type of people. And I'll let you start out first with what you tell people when it comes to like you're glamorizing this or your maybe wanting to be a serial killer or murderer yourself. Like, what do you say when people come at you like that?
I mean, in regards to like glamorizing it, I just got my Instagram taken down for that reason. They said that I was glorifying violence or encouraging violence with my stuff. And all I was doing was posting, like, "Oh, here's an item related to this case." Nothing graphic. But I mean, it's their platform. They can choose to do what they want, right? I'm not going to argue against it. I'm not upset about that. Um, when it comes to like glorification or whatever, it's just, I'm just finding things that people are interested in collecting and then buying them and selling them or tracking them down in a certain way. Um, I think that a big argument that people have for that kind of thing is that it's not providing anything of importance or historical value. But I mean, with me, for instance, right now, like the Dahmer book I just put out of all the letters to him, this all new information. I've got a second Dahmer book coming out with once again new information, um, unpublished photos. I'm working with documentaries on a few things. I have a lot of stuff that is, never before seen, never before heard stuff. And I think that when you're doing something that is preserving that kind of thing or bringing new information to light, people seem to have more respect for it. Um, in regards to like the serial killer thing, people being like, I had somebody from a TV network that I was talking to joke about this the other day. She was, uh, I said I was going camping for the weekend. She goes, You go camping a lot. Are you a serial killer too?" I said, "Yeah, for sure. I'll sell you the rights to my story before before it breaks, so we can do a series on it. Um, but yeah, it's uh, I mean, it would be the biggest red flag in the whole fucking world. Even if I did something, some kind of minor offense or some kind of minor anything that would raise any suspicion, or somebody would had to come to my apartment, for instance, right? Police would come to my apartment and look at things. It immediately it would be like, okay, well, there's human skulls in here. There's like stuff from Jeffrey Dahmer, there's stuff from John, all this stuff. It's such a red flag that there's no way I could fly under the radar. When people say that, I think um, they're looking at it as like, oh, if you're into this messed up shit, you must be like that kind of guy too. But I think people are missing the point of like, oh, uh, it's a comparable to like the, oh, somebody plays a bunch of violent video games, they must be a school shooter. It's like you can go to a school shooter's place after the crime and find some violent video games, but it's got nothing to do with it. It got no actual relation to what happened, right? It's a coincidental thing.
Right. Yeah. And what I always say is, well, for instance, there's a lot of people that collect murderabilia that are professionals, such as I have a criminologist friend that collects murderabilia. There's an active police officer, on the East Coast that collects murderabilia.
Yeah.
And, what I've always said is when I originally started collecting murderabilia, I wanted to get into the mind of a killer and see what makes them tick. But the more I've done this, I learn once you try to get into their head, they get into your head and they won't leave your head. And I still, I've more switched from collecting and selling murderabilia. I'm still selling everything off to the point where I won't have anything left, but I have, almost 13 years worth of stuff. So I've kind of switched over
Mm-hmm.
to interviewing convicted murderers and, survivors of violent crime, even law enforcement and mental health professionals. And
Mm-hmm.
when people try to come at the you must want to be a killer or you must want to be a serial killer, well, would that mean that all these people writing books on serial killers or producing documentaries, do they want to be serial killers too? Because you and I are making a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of the percentage of what these people are, writing books or producing documentaries and, so on and so forth. We're selling things from these killers. They're producing regurgitated, movies or films or
Mm-hmm.
books on these killers, and they're making millions while we're making, pennies. And I think that the comparison should be made. But being that you and I aren't professionals, in the law enforcement field or filmmaking field or anything like that, I feel like we get the short end of the stick, and then the bigwigs are the ones that are doing good and this and that, whether they're donating any money or not. It's
Mm-hmm.
this is well put together, professional, yada yada yada, and then we're just the weirdos that are profiting off of crime and hurting people, according to most, general consensus on murderabilia and true crime collectibles alike.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I felt that as well. I just from the beginning when I first started getting into this, I had the mindset of like, well, I know this is going to bother some people for sure. I know it's going to offend people. People will be upset, but in my head, I was like, but I totally have a right to, and I'm not trying to advocate for this hobby or interest. I'm just trying to, like I said, mind my own business and do what I enjoy. And I feel like there's a lot more people who have a negative view of it, talking out about it, than there are people who are interested in it, advocating for it, right? And I don't think I just don't think there's a positive to trying to advocate or unless there was some kind of reason that it became a legal issue and there was a reason to be like, okay, this is why we should be able to do this as a legitimate hobby or a business. I just feel like it's not ruffling feathers is never worth it. It's not. It's in this kind of industry, this kind of specific stuff. You don't want to like get on someone's bad side or be offensive or edgy. You got to be careful with what you're doing.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and there's a lot of people that do come into this hobby wanting to be edgy, whether it be the crime scene photos or just collecting certain names or whatever, just to,
Mm-hmm.
flex on their friends or whatever. Like I have handprints from a child killer, I have handprints from a serial killer, whatever. Like, and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people get into it just to make money. A lot of people really aren't interested in the actual collecting aspect. And at first, I was into it with the money, but then as years went by, I'm like, man, this is actually really interesting, and I got to
Mm-hmm.
establish rapport with inmates visiting and phone calls and so on and so forth. And to me, it's an actual hobby and interest and passion rather than just a way to make money. The money is cool, and that's like a bonus, but it's also like you said, educational. And like
Mm-hmm.
I just released a book called The Macabre and Morbid: Blood Literature and Art and Oddities, and that takes a more educational approach. Especially the intro of the book is written by James Sparks, a criminologist friend of mine, and it has different scans of artwork, letters, so on and so forth, of infamous serial killers specifically, that people can look at and see this stuff for what it really is. And if they want to get into the mind of a killer, they can just get a glimpse in there. And nothing glamorizing murder or anything of the sort. And there's a lot of books out there that are similar in the sense of showcasing art or whatever that killers have made over the years.
Yeah, I mean, in regards to the kind of people who are looking at it from an edgier kind of side, I think John Waters said was quoted as saying nobody buys a John Wayne Gacy painting because he was a good painter. You know, you buy it because you want to say to your friends, "Hey, look, a serial killer painted this. This is from John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown." Right? Um, one of my biggest pet peeves. This is a bit of a sidetrack. One of my biggest pet peeves that I get from people is I get a lot of messages on Instagram about like what people wanting to talk about collecting or items and stuff, which is fine. I get it. Like I'm a business first in that regard. I have to make time for that because I'm self-employed. I have to manage my time so I can do the projects I need to do to make a living. So I'm happy to chat with people sometimes when I have time to, but I get a lot of people who will message me all the time saying, "Oh, I want to buy this item. I want to buy that item." Things that are way beyond their budget, or they just don't really have an interest in getting. And it almost seems a lot of the time like these people are trying to have a reason to say to their friends, "Hey, check out what I almost bought." It's like a weird kind of flex of like I have some people who will comment on a lot of videos or a lot of posts saying, "Oh, really want it, really would looking to get one of these. What's the price?" And I'll be like, "Oh, I'll message you," and they just never ever get back to me for anything. And it's almost like people have this weird kind of empowerment in wanting to be that cool, dark, edgy guy. Whereas I think for you and me, obviously, I think we're pretty desensitized to this kind of stuff. If I had like a friend come over for the first time and see it, they're like, "Oh, this is crazy. This stuff is so dark. Do you ever have any like weird energy or heebie-jeebies around this?" But for me, it's just like stuff.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah, I get asked that a lot too, is if do you feel like anything's haunted? I'm like, no, I even have a necklace that was blessed by Sarah Aldretti that supposedly has a Nigerian man's spirit in there. And if
Mm-hmm.
anything, that thing should be haunted. But yeah, no, no.
Yeah, well, I just don't understand the thought process of, oh, a crime was committed in the vicinity of this thing, so therefore negative energy got attached to a physical item, or oh, so and so owned this in prison or wrote this letter, so therefore it's evil. Because it's not like these people are spreading this invisible evilness all over the place. There's people who did evil things who are regular people or did bad things or negative things. I live right by like a crematorium, like super close. If anything, there's going to be some fucking negative energy or haunting stuff coming from the fact that there's bodies being carted in and out of that place all day long, every single day, right by my house, right? And that's not an issue. No one talks about like, oh, I live near a funeral home and the whole block is haunted because of it.
Right, right. And I could see people thinking that, more like the skull behind you could be haunted more than a piece of
Yeah,
paper written on by John Wayne Gacy, because that's literally somebody's,
yeah.
human skull. But yeah, when it comes to actual objects, I don't get the is it haunted? And there's some people that
Mm,
there's some collectors that have said that they've had things go on with their stuff here and there. And like,
mm,
maybe it's just your mind playing tricks on you, or maybe it's an old house. But yeah, I don't think any of the
mm.
stuff's haunted, but to each their own. I mean,
Yeah.
people want to get a Richard Ramirez letter, a Jeffrey Dahmer letter, and they think maybe something weird will happen in their house or
Mm.
whatever. But
Yeah,
yeah,
if the idea of that energy does something for you, by all means, enjoy it. But I'm not trying to like throw away anyone's beliefs or disregard anyone's beliefs. It's just not something that I've personally experienced.
right, right. So, before we get out of here, I want to talk about we'll have a Patreon set up soon, and we'll be doing so. this podcast will specifically be Taylor and I, but on Patreon we'll be having occasional, guest interviews with other collectors and even prisoners talking about Murderabilia, their thoughts on Murderabilia and other, random bits and pieces that they want to talk about.
Mm,
And we'll, probably set up some type of tiers, whether it's, prison documents that aren't really public information or certain murderabilia that hasn't really been seen by anybody, whether that's from my collection or Taylor's collection, and
mm.
so much more. I mean, we're gonna definitely brainstorm and get some stuff up there, and we definitely plan on, we're looking forward to growing with everybody and having everybody, listen and just grow with us and take this adventure with us.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a specific niche of the true crime hobby, and there's so many people so interested in it. And my kind of perspective going into this is just it's kind of like a bit more of an open behind the scenes thing, not necessarily giving away like the business secrets. I think the thing I get asked more than anything is, oh, where do you get this stuff? And like, I get people are interested in that, but it's like I'm not going to be like, oh, hey, here's a list of where I find all my things, because then someone goes there and does that and starts their own website. It's like this is the years of experience I have in building this. So we're not going to be like, oh, go here to buy this stuff for this price or whatever, but definitely getting into the behind the scenes of it and like writing and having personal connections with inmates. Like finding things out in the wild versus having people come to you versus getting things directly from inmates or inmates' families or whatever. Um, there's just so many roads we can go down, we can go on about for so long. And then talking about like new interesting things we found, collections we found, items we brought in. Um, yeah, there's just so much to go on about with this, and no one's really covering it in any kind of consistent way. I don't think there's there's a lot of interviews, and there's a lot of little things out there, but there's no consistent kind of update of, oh, here's what's happening in this world right now. So it's kind of my goal in doing this.
Right. And we'll be releasing episodes bi-weekly, every other week, twice a month. And when it comes to Patreon, we'll figure that out down the road and
Mm-hmm.
we'll continue to provide updates as we release episodes. So yeah, is there anything that you could think of that you want to add before we get out of here?
No, I think that's pretty much it. I'm gonna have videos up on my YouTube. You'll have them on your YouTube as well, I think, plus podcast platforms. If you're watching it on my YouTube, I'll have it in the description. I'll have links to every other spot to find this and every other thing related. So check that out if you're seeing that. Yeah, and I think that kind of covers it for the first. This is a good little introduction here.
Sweet. Well, we'll get out of here, and this is episode 1 of Murderabilia Exposed.